28 Years Later is a film out of time. I don't just mean because it was released 5 years off when its title promised, and 5 years after the original's haunting images of a pandemic-stricken Britain came to life. Where 28 Days Later captured the raw, digitised mundanity of a modern world on the brink of collapse, 28 Years Later feels more like a work of high fantasy from a bygone era, which, despite being filmed through the eerily contemporary lens of an iPhone, has its gaze fixed squarely on the past. A past which had seemingly slipped from decades into millennia, making the early 21st century feel more like the 8th.
How many hundreds of years have we fallen this time? Is it thousands or more?
The medieval subtext of 28 Years Later isn't exactly hidden. Skyscrapers have been swapped for dense forests and dry stone walls, the assault weapons of the first two films for bows and arrows, apartment blocks for watchtowers. Director Danny Boyle even intercuts footage from the Battle of Agincourt, as depicted in the 1944 film adaptation of Shakespeare's Henry V. As a story, it has all the trappings of an archetypal hero narrative. Spike, our young protagonist, leaves the comfort of his community, somewhere between a 1940s street party and an Anglo-Saxon mead hall, and goes to find his place in the natural order.
I'll come back when I'm ready. I want to keep walking until I can't see the sea.
These aesthetic choices might clash with the original's stark, modern vision of societal collapse, but they get to the heart of something much deeper that anchors 28 Years Later's apocalyptic insights in the philosophy of a lost old England. Indeed, the feeling of loss, of yearning for a better time, is peculiarly English. Lots of people have picked up on the film's implicit commentary on Brexit and British isolationism, and the associated nostalgia for a more culturally and globally dominant kingdom, as highlighted by writer Alex Garland.
There's a real preoccupation related to looking backwards, how things used to be, trying to make things great again or recover a state of glorious sovereignty or whatever it happens to be. And I think that the feature of that is in part that it's regressive. It's not looking forwards to build in a way, it's looking back to recapture.
This might be the contemporary subtext for the film, but the past that echoes throughout 28 Years Later is strikingly alien to the 1 hour nostalgia evokes. Instead of metropolitan London, we're now in the northeast of England, with the holy island of Lindisfarne as our starting point. Lindisfarne was the site of the first Viking invasion of the British Isles in 793, making the appearance of a Swedish NATO soldier, Eric, later on in the film, heavy with historical significance.
I'm actually a Viking. Maybe if I get infected, I'll turn into one.
But this region also has an important place in English literary history. When we talk about Old English, you'd probably think of Shakespeare. In fact, he wrote in what you'd officially call early modern English. Old English, by contrast, is a practically unrecognisable language, closer to Old Norse or German. The world in which this language was spoken, often secondary to Latin, is relatively unknown. Being in the Dark Ages, an early phase of the medieval period for which we have shockingly few historical records, our assumptions of that time are based largely on what few traces remain. But thanks to scribes like the monk Bede, an early chronicler of English history based in Northumbria, we have small scraps like the poem known as Cædmon's Hymn, the earliest surviving text written in Old English, dated to around 660 AD, a century before the Viking invasion of Lindisfarne. Even today, the Northumbrian dialect of the northeast keeps traces of Old English in its vocabulary. To understand why this setting and its medieval heritage have been picked as the backdrop to 28 Years Later, we need to immerse ourselves in the world these texts evoke. Of the few that we still have, a large number belong to the genre of elegy. These are poems about lone wastrels, wandering the wild landscape of England, often in exile from their kingdoms and the safety of their lords. To a modern reader, they feel like works of post-apocalyptic fiction, gloomily referring back to some great calamity, which is often the fall of man from the Garden of Eden. Even before the Viking attacks, England was a land that had seen its fair share of doomsday events. After the departure of the ruling Romans in the 5th century, the island became home to a diaspora of Germanic tribes, who formed dominant yet fragmented kingdoms, what's commonly known as the Heptarchy, a system of warring factions not unlike those surviving in the world of 28 years later. In fact, around the time when the first Anglo-Saxon or Old English texts are dated, it was recorded that the island was ravaged by a deadly pandemic in 664, which happened to coincide with a solar eclipse, heralded as a punishment from God for man's transgression. As we see in the opening moments of 28 years later, great diseases can inspire fears of divine retribution.
Oh no, son. Not dead. Saved. This is a glorious day. Day of judgment.
In the newly Christianized territories of England in the first millennium, the idea of living in a fallen world ravaged by sin reverberated across a country of fragmented kingdoms and isolated communities. In 28 years later, the older monuments of English history, like Fountains Abbey, where Spike and Isla take refuge, sit alongside deserted structures of modernity, like the timeless Angel of the North statue by the sculptor Anthony Gormley.
You said it would stand like this forever. Like the pyramids or Stonehenge.
Even natural landmarks evoke a lost time, especially the shot of Sycamore Gap, an iconic landmark of the northeast that was senselessly felled by vandals back in 2023. 28 years later was filmed in 2024, so what we see is a digital recreation of the iconic tree, another act of imaginative remembrance on the part of Danny Boyle for this alternative future. The landscape of Old English poetry is similarly one of desolation and ruin, and these crumbling structures are frequently where the poetic imagination takes hold. In a poem commonly known as The Ruin, in part because the surviving manuscript is itself in pieces, the anonymous speaker reflects on a grand ruinated structure, the Enter Georg, or Work of Giants, musing on the lost society that inhabited it before death seized them. Some have theorised that the poem could refer to Stonehenge, one of the most enigmatic icons of England's prehistory, but a more common assumption links its subject to the ruins of Roman colonisation found in cities like Bath. Monuments are incredibly important to the future Garland and Boyle present, and none more so than Dr. Kelson's Bone Temple. These are sites of loss and memory, reminders that everything wastes away.
Every skull is a set of thoughts. These sockets saw, and these jaws spoke and swallowed. This is a monument to them. A temple.
Again, this is a sentiment taken straight from the elegies of Old English literature. Old English elegies often invoke a tradition from Latin poetry, ubi sunt, or where are they, where the speakers reflect not only on the passing of the dead and departed, but the meaning of death itself.
Do you know the words memento mori?
No.
It's Latin. Ironically, it's a dead language. It means remember death.
28 years later is as much about commemoration as it is about survival. It's why for Jamie, Spike's dad, the legend of their exploits on the mainland is far more important than their actual accomplishments.
Can't go back now, Dad.
Why?
Everyone will think I'm soft.
Oh, they will. Can't have that, can we?
They return to the community hall as victorious warriors, telling stories and drinking beer in a scene straight out of Beowulf. Probably the most famous of the Old English texts, Beowulf is a poem that foregrounds the importance of commemorating a heroic age. It's believed to have been passed down orally before being recorded in the text known as the Noel Codex, dating from around the 10th century. This process of encoding heroic legacy is woven into the story, as a shop or court poet recites Beowulf's victories and his defeats, ultimately in commemoration after his death in battle against a great dragon. Storytelling is a core part of the Old English cycle of birth and death, which we see embodied in 28 years later by Isla's passing and her rebirth in the Child of the Infected, as Spike carries her skull like a fetus to the top of Kelson's monument.
Memento mori. What did it mean?
Remember, we must die.
And it's true. There are many kinds of death.
The acceptance of death that Kelson encourages in Spike is incredibly refreshing for this kind of film, and surprising given just how central it used to be in the philosophy of Old English culture. For many, the sequel Danny Boyle and Alex Garland had offered for their 2002 masterpiece wasn't just a shadow of the original, but a completely unrecognisable descendant that swapped the simple, stark vision of societal collapse for something chaotic, kaleidoscopic, even archaic. As someone who not only hadn't seen the original, but was born a year after its world ended, I came to 28 years later from a very different perspective, without the nostalgia of a long-term fan. My first and strongest impression of Danny Boyle as a director was the opening ceremony to the 2012 London Olympics. I remember just how inspiring it was to see British culture presented so joyfully over those few hours. But in the years since, it's become something of a memorial. The mood in the UK is pretty dire right now, and has been for pretty much the last decade. In some ways, 28 years later is Danny Boyle's anti-Olympic ceremony. Not least because it's so steeped in this distant, almost alien vision of the British Isles, which has no trace or reference in his ceremony of bright colours and cultural diversity. In the current political turmoil of post-Olympic Britain, this medieval imagery has become associated with national pride, a time of heroes who valiantly fought off invaders. But this whitewashed medievalism conceals something that's always been there: loss and grief for a bygone era, which fell and adapted to the waves of pandemic and conflict. It may not have released exactly when its title promised, but really, 28 years later couldn't have come out at a better time. It wasn't what people expected, but that's exactly the point. The loss that many fans felt is an extension of a mood that has always dominated English culture, since long before the fall of the British Empire. The sequel, which looks to put Kelson's memorial structure at the centre, looks like it will continue Garland and Boyle's exploration of England's monumental past, especially as the spectre of Jimmy Savile, perhaps the most notorious cultural ruin in modern British history, looms large over Jimmy Crystal's gang of rogues. But whether or not the rest of the planned trilogy takes us forward or further backwards in time remains to be seen.